At 78 years old, he'd survived 2 wars and countless battles at home, but nothing prepared him for what happened at 30,000 feet. When the flight attendant told him to give up his paid seat for corporate executives, he quietly complied, limping to the back row with his cane, squeezed into a middle seat despite his war-damaged knee. The other passengers barely noticed the elderly black man being displaced, but the pilot did. And when Captain Barnes discovered who was sitting in row 31, he walked out his cockpit, commanded the attention of every passenger, and did something that would be filmed and shared around the world. What happened next wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about recognition decades overdue, dignity restored, and the moment when one man's quiet heroism finally met the respect it deserved. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is absolutely mind-blowing. Ezekiel Carter adjusted his grip on the worn aluminum cane as he approached gate B-12. At 78, his shoulders still carried the ramrod posture of a lifetime soldier, but his left knee, shattered by shrapnel in Fallujah 15 years ago, reminded him daily that some battles leave permanent marks. The morning light streaming through Reagan National's windows caught the faded Army insignia on his weather jacket, a quiet testament to service that spanned 2 wars and 4 decades. He'd purchased the aisle seat months ago, seat 12C, understanding his limitations. Long flights required room to stretch the damaged joint, space to maneuver without bumping fellow passengers with his cane. It wasn't vanity. It was necessity wrapped in the dignity of a man who'd learned to navigate a world that often saw his age and color before his service. The early boarding call crackled over the intercom. Pre-boarding for passengers requiring assistance and our premium members. Ezekiel rose slowly, presenting his boarding pass to the gate agent, a tired-looking woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes as she scanned the barcode. Seat 12C, Mr. Carter. Have a good flight. The jetway stretched ahead like a tunnel, and Ezekiel moved at his measured pace. Other passengers floated around him, business travelers clutching phones, families juggling carry-ons, the urgent energy of people with places to be. He understood their hurry. He'd been there once, racing through airports in desert camouflage, heading toward uncertainty. Flight attendant Jessica Williams stood at the aircraft entrance, her practiced smile bright as commercial lighting. 26 years old, 2 years on the job. She'd been briefed that morning about a VIP accommodation request from corporate. The details were vague, but the message was clear. Make it happen, make it smooth, avoid complications. Good morning, welcome aboard, she chirped as Ezekiel handed her his boarding pass. Morning, miss. His voice carried the measured cadence of a man accustomed to being heard the first time he spoke. She glanced at the pass, then at him, something flickering across her expression. Not recognition, exactly, but a subtle recalibration. Sir, I'm going to need to speak with you about your seat assignment. Ezekiel paused, leaning slightly on his cane. Something wrong with 12C? Well, we have a situation. Jessica's voice dropped to the tone reserved for delivering disappointing news. We have a group of executives who need to sit together for an important meeting, and we're going to need to move a few passengers to accommodate them. I paid for this seat specifically. No anger, just fact. Requested when I booked because of my knee. I understand, sir, and we appreciate your flexibility. We can move you to 31B, it's a middle seat, but we'll make sure you're comfortable. The words hung in the narrow aisle. Around them, passengers continued boarding, the flow of humanity stepping around their small crisis. Ezekiel looked down the cabin toward row 12, then back toward the distant row 31. The mathematics were simple. His damaged knee, the confined space, the long flight to Washington, D.C. The middle seat, he repeated quietly. Yes, sir. And, of course, we'll provide you with extra snacks and a complimentary beverage. Extra snacks. As if peanuts could compensate for the deep ache he'd feel for hours, the inability to extend his leg, the indignity of being compressed between strangers. But Ezekiel Carter had learned 60 years ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, that sometimes survival meant choosing which hills to die on. All right, he said simply. Jessica's relief was palpable. Thank you so much for understanding, Mr. Carter. You're a real gentleman. He made his way down the narrow aisle, past the premium seats, past the executives who would claim his space. Three men in identical Navy suits, already spreading documents across tray tables, phones pressed to ears, the urgent pantomime of important business. None looked up as he passed. Row 31 waited like a punishment. The middle seat was exactly as narrow as he'd imagined, flanked by a college student wearing noise-canceling headphones and a businessman already asleep against a window. Ezekiel lowered himself carefully, wincing as his knee protested the confined angle. His cane barely fit in the space before him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd flown into combat zones with less discomfort than this domestic flight would provide. But then, enemy fire was honest in its intent. This was something else entirely. The casual erosion of dignity that happened when people looked through you rather than at you, when accommodation became charity rather than basic courtesy. As the plane filled around him, Ezekiel closed his eyes and tried to find the meditation techniques he'd learned in veterans counseling. Breathe through the pain. Focus on the destination. In 6 hours, he'd be in D.C. for Marcus Williams' funeral, his last surviving squad mate from Vietnam, another brother in arms heading home. The businessman beside him shifted, accidentally bumping Ezekiel's injured knee. The sharp pain shot up his thigh, but he absorbed it silently, the way he'd absorbed so many other indignities over the decades. Some battles weren't worth fighting. Some hills weren't worth dying on. But sometimes Ezekiel would learn the battle chooses you. Captain David Barnes completed his pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision of 18 years in commercial aviation. Former Air Force, he understood the weight of responsibility that came with moving 150 souls through the sky. But today felt different. A restlessness had settled in his chest, the kind of unease that made experienced pilots double-check instruments that were already perfect. He glanced toward the cabin through the cockpit door's window, watching the final passengers settle into their seats. The boarding process had taken longer than usual, something about last-minute seat changes, corporate accommodations. David had learned not to involve himself in cabin politics unless safety was at stake. Flight attendants managed people, pilots managed aircraft. But his eyes kept drifting to row 31. An older black man sat compressed in the middle seat, his discomfort visible even from this distance. The man's posture spoke of military bearing despite his obvious physical distress, the way he held his shoulders square even as his body folded into the inadequate space. A cane rested precariously against his legs. Captain Barnes. Jessica appeared at the cockpit door, her cheerful demeanor slightly frayed around the edges. "We're ready for departure when you are." "That gentleman in 31B, David said, nodding toward the cabin. Was he moved from another seat? Jessica's pause lasted a heartbeat too long. "Yes, sir. We had a group seating request from corporate. Standard accommodation. Standard." David repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. "What's the story?" "I'm sorry. The passenger. What do you know about him?" Jessica consulted her tablet. Scrolling through passenger information. Ezekiel Carter. Traveling alone to D.C. paid passenger. No special accommodations noted. Something about the name tugged at David's memory, but he couldn't place it. He studied the man again. The weathered hands folded over the cane, the patient way he endured the confined space, the dignity that poverty of comfort couldn't diminish. "I'll be right back," David said, unbuckling from his seat. "Sir, we're cleared for departure." 2 minutes. David made his way down the aisle, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being in charge. Passengers glanced up as he passed. The sight of a pilot in the cabin always drew attention, the assumption that something was either very wrong or very right. He stopped at row 31. "Excuse me, sir. Are you Mr. Carter?" Ezekiel looked up, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Yes, Captain. I'm David Barnes. May I ask, did you serve?" A slight smile touched Ezekiel's weathered features. "Army. 2 tours Vietnam, 1 Iraq." "Iraq." The word hit David like recognition. "What unit?" "1st Armored Division, 2nd Brigade." "Why?" David's world shifted. The restlessness in his chest crystallized into something clearer, more urgent. "Mr. Carter, did you know a Staff Sergeant Michael Barnes?" "Combat medic." Ezekiel's eyes widened. "Mickey Barnes. Tall kid from Oregon. always carried extra morphine. He paused, studying David's face. You favor him around the eyes. He's my younger brother. David's voice caught. Mr. Carter, Mickey told me about Fallujah, about the IED that took out his Humvee, about the soldier who carried him 2 miles through sniper fire to the evac point. The cabin around them seemed to fade. Other passengers continued their conversations, unaware that 2 decades of gratitude had just collided with a middle seat in row 31. That was my job, Ezekiel said quietly. That was my brother's life, David replied. For a moment, neither man spoke. The aircraft's engines hummed their pre-flight rhythm, the sound of preparation for journey. But this journey had already begun years ago on a desert road where one soldier refused to leave another behind. David looked toward the front of the plane, toward the executives occupying seats that should have belonged to a man who'd saved his brother's life. The mathematics were simple, but the equation was wrong. Mr. Carter, would you mind coming with me? Ezekiel struggled to his feet, accepting David's offered arm. Together, they moved toward the front of the aircraft, past curious passengers, past the flight attendants who watched with growing concern, past the executives who finally looked up from their documents. Diana Rothschild, Senior Vice President of Client Relations, realized immediately that her morning's careful choreography was about to be disrupted. She'd personally arranged a seating accommodation for Peterson Industries' executive team, a multi-million-dollar account that required delicate handling. The sight of the captain escorting the displaced passenger toward first class triggered every alarm in her corporate-trained mind. Captain Barnes, she called out, rising from her seat. Is there a problem? David stopped, his hand still supporting Ezekiel's elbow. The cabin's conversations gradually quieted as passengers sensed drama unfolding. Ms. Rothschild, isn't it? David's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. There's been a mistake. I'm not sure I understand. This gentleman is Ezekiel Carter, Sergeant First Class, retired. He saved my brother's life in Iraq. David's voice rose enough for nearby passengers to hear. And somehow, he's been moved from the seat he purchased and paid for to accommodate your executives. Diana's practiced smile faltered. Around them, phones began emerging from pockets. In the age of social media, confrontations between authority figures played out in real time, viral moments born from seconds of poor judgment. Captain, I'm sure we can resolve this quietly. You're right. David turned to address the cabin, his pilot's voice carrying to every row. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to Sergeant First Class Ezekiel Carter, United States Army. This man served 2 tours in Vietnam and 1 in Iraq. In 2010, he carried my wounded brother 2 miles through enemy fire to save his life. The cabin fell silent, except for the aircraft's mechanical breathing. Sergeant Carter purchased seat 12C month ago because of injuries sustained in service to his country. This morning, he was moved to a middle seat in the back of the plane to accommodate a corporate group. David faced Ezekiel, his expression gray with the weight of overdue recognition. Sir, would you please return to your purchase seat? Then Captain David Barnes, 18-year veteran of commercial aviation, former Air Force pilot, came to attention and rendered a slow, deliberate salute to the old soldier standing beside him. The cabin erupted. Passengers rose from their seats, applause thundering through the confined space. Phones captured the moment. The young pilot honoring the old soldier, dignity restored at 30,000 feet before they'd even left the ground. Diana Rothschild sank into her seat, understanding that her carefully arranged accommodation had just become a public relations catastrophe. But in that moment, as Ezekiel Carter slowly returned the salute with tears gathering in his weathered eyes, the only thing that mattered was a recognition that some debts transcend time, that honor delayed is not honor denied, and that sometimes justice arrives wearing a pilot's uniform. The walk back to seat 12C felt different this time. Passengers who had barely noticed Ezekiel during boarding now met his eyes with nods of respect, some offering quiet, "Thank you for your service," as he passed. The college student from row 31 stood up, extending his hand. Sir, I just wanted to shake your hand. My grandfather served in Korea. Ezekiel accepted the gesture with grace. What was his name, son? James Mitchell. He never talked much about it. They usually don't. Ezekiel's voice carried the weight of understanding. But we remember them. Jessica Williams approached as he settled into his rightful seat, her earlier corporate efficiency replaced by something more genuine. Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology. I should have asked more questions, should have understood the situation better. You were doing your job, miss. No, sir, I wasn't. My job is to take care of passengers. All passengers. Can I bring you some water? Coffee. Water will be fine, thank you. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, David Barnes' voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, from the flight deck, I want to thank you for your patience during our delay. We're honored to have some very special passengers aboard today, including veterans who've served our country with distinction. Flight time to Reagan National is approximately 6 hours. Sit back, relax, and thank you for flying with us. The executives from Peterson Industries remained subdued in their seats, their important meeting materials forgotten. Diana Rothschild stared out her window, already composing the damage control emails she'd need to send before landing. But her gaze kept drifting to man in 12C, trying to reconcile the displacement she'd orchestrated with the hero she'd unknowingly displaced. An hour into the flight, a younger black man approached from several rows back. He wore a crisp business suit, but moved with the measured gait of someone who'd worn different uniforms. Excuse me, sir. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Johnson, Army Reserve. I heard what happened up front. Ezekiel looked up from the book he'd been reading, a worn paperback biography of Thurgood Marshall. Evening, Colonel. Sir, I wanted you to know that what Captain Barnes did, it matters, not just for you, but for all of us who served. Too many of our brothers and sisters come home to indifference or worse. Things are changing, son. Slowly, but they're changing. Marcus nodded toward the front of the plane. Maybe faster than we think. That moment back there, people filmed it. By the time we land, half the country will have seen it. And what do you think they'll see? Truth, sir. They'll see what respect looks like when it's given where it's due. As Marcus returned to his seat, Ezekiel reflected on the colonel's words. In his 7 decades of life, he'd witnessed America's fitful progress toward justice. The integration of the military, the civil rights movement, the slow recognition of black veterans' contributions. Each step forward had been a hard one, often incomplete, but steps nonetheless. A flight attendant from the first-class cabin approached, someone Ezekiel hadn't seen before. Mr. Carter, I'm Sarah Chun, purser for this flight. The captain asked me to give you this. She handed him a small envelope bearing the airline's insignia. Inside, on official letterhead, David Barnes had written, Asterisk Sergeant Carter, my brother Mickey died 3 years ago in a car accident in Portland. I never got to thank you properly for bringing him home from Iraq. Today, I finally could. With deepest gratitude and respect, Captain David Barnes asterisk. Ezekiel folded the note carefully, placing it in his jacket pocket next to another letter, the one from the Department of Veterans Affairs notifying him of Marcus Williams' funeral. 2 pieces of paper, one representing loss, the other acknowledgement, the balance of a soldier's life. The flight continued smoothly eastward, chasing the sun toward Washington. Passengers settled into the rhythm of air travel. Movies on seatback screens, quiet conversations, the gentle turbulence of crossing weather systems. But something had changed in the cabin's atmosphere, a subtle shift in how people looked at each other, how courtesy was extended. A young woman traveling with her daughter stopped by a seat during the meal service. Sir, my daughter wants to thank you for your service, but she's shy. Ezekiel smiled at the girl, maybe 8 years old, peeking out from behind her mother's arm. What's your name, sweetheart? Emma, she whispered. That's a beautiful name. Do you know what service means, Emma? The girl shook her head. It means doing something important even when it's hard, even when people don't notice. Like your mom taking care of you, or teachers helping you learn. Everybody serves in different ways. Emma considered this solemnly, then stepped forward and handed him a drawing she'd made on a napkin, stick figures of a soldier and a little girl, with thank you written in careful crayon letters. This is beautiful, Emma. I'll keep it with me, okay? As they walked back to their seats, Ezekiel studied the child's artwork. In her innocent rendering, He saw something profound. The next generation learning that service deserves recognition, that dignity belongs to everyone, that honor can be as simple as saying thank you. The aircraft began its descent into Reagan National as the sun set over the Potomac. Through his window, Ezekiel could see the familiar landmarks of the city he'd visited many times. The Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the bridges connecting past and future. Tomorrow, he would attend Marcus Williams' funeral at Arlington National Cemetery, the last goodbye to his final squad mate from Vietnam. But tonight, as the wheels touched down and passengers began gathering their belongings, Ezekiel Carter felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The deep satisfaction of being truly seen, of having his service acknowledged not as charity, but as recognition of debt owed and finally paid. Captain Barnes' voice filled the cabin one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Washington, D.C. Local time is 8:47 p.m. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for flying with us today. For our veterans aboard, thank you for your service to our nation. As passengers filed off the aircraft, many stopped to shake Ezekiel's hand, to offer words of gratitude, to acknowledge the lesson they'd witnessed. The executives from Peterson Industries passed without comment, but Diana Rothschild paused. Mr. Carter, I want to apologize for this morning. It was poorly handled. Ma'am, you were serving your company's interests. I understand that. But there are some things more important than corporate interests, aren't there? Ezekiel studied her face, seeing something genuine beneath the corporate polish. Yes, ma'am, there are. He was among the last to deplane, moving slowly but with purpose. At the gate, Captain Barnes waited, still in uniform, his pilot's cap tucked under his arm. Mr. Carter, thank you for allowing me to do what I should have done years ago. Captain, your brother was a good man. He talked about you all the time, worried about your family back home. You raised him right. He raised himself, sir. You just made sure he got the chance to come home and finish the job. They shook hands, two men connected by service, by loss, by the understanding that some debts transcend individual gratitude to become something larger, more essential. Walking to the terminal, Ezekiel moved with the steady pace of someone who had places to be, but no need to hurry. His reflection caught in the polished floors, an elderly black man with a cane, traveling alone, unremarkable to casual observation. But today had taught him something important. Recognition delayed is not recognition denied. Dignity deferred is not dignity destroyed. Outside, he climbed into a taxi for the ride to his hotel. Tomorrow would bring grief and remembrance, the final farewell to a generation of warriors. But tonight brought something else. The knowledge that sometimes, at 30,000 feet or in the middle seat in row 31, justice finds a way to break through, carrying the courage of those willing to do what's right rather than what's convenient. The taxi pulled away from the curb, carrying Ezekiel Carter toward his final mission for Marcus Williams. Behind him, the aircraft that had carried him home sat quietly at the gate, ordinary in every way except for the extraordinary moment it hosted, when a pilot walked out his cockpit to salute a soldier, when recognition found its way to row 12C, when dignity rose above the careful calculations of corporate convenience. Some flights carry passengers, others carry justice, and sometimes, if you're fortunate enough to witness it, they carry both.